We believe in one God, as revealed by Scripture in the person of Jesus Christ. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe that He died for our sins, to restore all things in right relationship with the King. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe that all things are good, that what God says in His Word is true, and that He meant every word. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind. We believe the future's open, that God is free and He's Lord of the possibilities. Study to show yourselves approved, and believe these things that you might be transformed by the renewing of your mind.
Well, hello and welcome to the Tattered Bible Podcast, where we study to show ourselves approved. So at the top of the show, I just want to do my usual run through. So at the bottom of this video, you will find links to Paul Vendredi's channels and also to my link tree. So if you click on the link tree, you will get resources, including this channel and Tattered Bible Plus. Tattered Bible Plus is in the planning stages right now, and you can support the Indiegogo campaign for Tattered Bible Plus. If you go here and put your email in, you'll get 10% off when the campaign launches. Then there's YouTube channels I endorse, some good churches, and some books. If you click on Paul Vendredi's channels, there's Paul Vendredi, there's Christian Theological Archive. Please like, share, and subscribe over there. And there's paulvendredi.com. Here is my channel. Wait a minute. Let me pause my trailer I made. So I made a new design to my channel. So as you can see, you have For You, shorts, videos, past live streams, upcoming live streams, which we are on right now, popular videos, multiple playlists, and channels I endorse. So all my friends, and there's a lot more, all my friends are down here. So please check that out. And without further ado, here is Paul Vendredi.
Wow, we're 4 minutes into the show, almost 5 minutes, and I'm finally getting to talk. I'll tell you what, that trailer, I'm still marveling at the speed at which those quotes are going by. I was using every Jim Quick speed reading trick I know of, and I still couldn't finish all those quotes.
Yeah, it is. You know, when you said that, I realized I didn't need to change the quotes for each one, so it's still the same quotes as the first one. It's quotes from chapter 1 and chapter 3. I was going, what I was gonna do was I was gonna take like beginning, middle, end of the sections we're reading, but when I got to chapter 3, I finished the whole chapter and then only had time to put in the coming attractions, the countdown, and the like, share, subscribe at the end.
All right. Having said all of that, why don't we plunge into our project for today?
Yes.
We're doing chapter 22 through chapter 27, and 27 is the end of Leviticus. We're beginning in chapter 22. We're dealing now with priestly regulations, and it begins with rules for rank and file priests. In other words, these are members of the Aaronic order. They're Aaronic priests, but they're not the high priest. The first rule is a little obscurely worded. It says that, in fact, maybe you can just read what it says there.
Sure.
Read 1 through 4 if you would.
Okay, so, and the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto Aaron and to his sons, that they separate themselves from the holy things of the children of Israel, and that they profane not my holy name in those things which they hallow unto me. I am the Lord. Say unto them, whosoever he be of all your seed among your generation that goes unto the holy things which the children of Israel hallow unto the Lord, having his uncleanness upon him, that soul shall be cut off from among my presence.
Let's leave it right there.
Lord.
Yeah, let's leave it right there. It's obscurely worded. It keeps referring to holy things. As you read through the chapter, we discover that the holy things refers primarily to the bread and also to the other offerings, the remnants of which the priests are allowed to keep and eat. So these basically are rules against sacrilege, and it would be sacrilege against any kind of sacrificial offering that the priests eat. Sacrilege, of course, means to treat a holy object in an unholy way, to treat the sacred as if it's profane. We're moving on to verses 4 through 7. We're still with the regulations on the rank and file, and this has to do with profaning the sacred food by being in a state of uncleanliness, ceremonial uncleanliness, that is. In verse 4, no priest who happens to have contracted leprosy is allowed to touch the food. No priest who has touched a corpse. In other words, if he has just presided over a funeral, we went over that last time, all the regulations on funerals. And if he's had a discharge, whether of pus, blood, or semen, or whatever other kind of discharge, they have to go through they have to wait until sunset, and they have to wash with water, and then afterwards they're made ceremonially clean and can then touch the food offerings again. Verse 8, it's a sacrilege if the priest has touched carrion, roadkill, we would say nowadays.
Yeah.
Verse 9, these are general rules about sacrilege. It's interesting to me that these are called an ordinance. We had talked in a previous interview about the words judgments, statutes, laws, commandments, ordinances. There may be a difference between those two, but it's not clear whether the book of Leviticus is making a difference. But if there is, that would take quite a bit more study on my part to figure out. Maybe these refer to temporary laws, and maybe that refers to permanent laws. That's something that I'm continuing to work on in my own private studies. Verses 10 through 11, still with the rank and file priesthood. This revolves around the food again. So if the food has been taken from the sanctuary and brought back to the priest's house for consumption, no foreigner, no guest in the priest's house, and no hireling is allowed to touch that food. Those people have to eat other food. Interestingly enough, verse 11, if the priest owns slaves, they are allowed to eat the food. The slaves, this was the same thing in Roman society. The slaves were considered part of the family. That doesn't mean they were treated well. It's just means that they had the legal status of a family member. That seems to be the same thing here. Now we're moving on to verses 12 through 13. We're still in the priest's house, and these are rules for the daughters of the priests. A priest's daughter who is married to a foreigner may not eat the sacrifices. However, if she divorces the foreigner and moves back home, now she can eat the sacrificial food. The Old Testament gives us mixed messages with regard to interracial marriage. Sometimes it seems to think it's okay. More often than not, though, it usually has a prohibition of some kind on it. And what ended up developing in later Israelite society is complete endogamy. That is to say, you could only marry within your own racial group. So this is something that's not going to sit well with a lot of people, but again, there are mixed messages about mixed marriage in the Bible.
Yeah.
Most of the messages seem to be against it.
Yeah, but most of the messages against it have to do with religion, right? I mean, they didn't have the same concept of race that we do.
Well, they didn't have the same concept of race that we do, but it doesn't say that in this passage. If you go to verse 10, it's just a stranger, i.e. a foreigner, living in the priest's house. I understand there are a lot of sensitivities about this issue, but we have to let the Bible speak for itself. We cannot read our own political and cultural views into the Bible and make it say what it doesn't actually say in order just to make it more palatable. That would be the thing that the apologetics industrial complex does, and that's one of the reasons I swore off apologetics many years back. You know, if you go back 30 years ago, I was an intense, aggressive Protestant apologist. Then when I converted to Orthodoxy, I was the same thing, just on the Orthodox side. It took a lot of years for me to shed that. There is a difference between exegesis and propaganda. What the apologetics industrial complex does with the Bible is propaganda. What we are supposed to do with the Bible is exegesis. Let's continue. I think we just concluded verses 12 through 13. Am I right?
Yes.
All right, now we're on verse 14. If a rank and file priest commits an inadvertent sacrilege with any of the food, for example, if he had had a discharge of some kind and then touched the food and realized, uh-oh, I was supposed to bathe myself in water and wait until evening before I touched the food, there is a regulation on this. He has to restore the value of whatever that food is, plus 1/5. This measurement of 1/5 comes up quite a bit in these latter chapters of Leviticus, as we will see today. Verses 15 through 16, continuing with rank and file regulations. This is interesting because the word trespass in verse 16, you can see the King James uses the word trespass there. That indicates that this is ceremonial uncleanliness, and we discovered that in chapter 5 when we dealt with all the trespass offerings. So these rules on ceremonial cleanliness all go back to the trespass offerings of chapter 5. Going into verses 17 through 20, this appears to be another segment of the book of Leviticus that's been misplaced. This is about burnt offerings. Interestingly, verse 18 refers to burnt offerings of cattle, sheep, and goats as free will offerings. And it links it with another type of sacrifice that's known as a votive offering or with a vow. If I were in charge of reconstructing the book of Leviticus, this would go back into chapter 1, because this is giving you specifics on what has to be done with the burnt offerings, the holocausts, in other words. That's when the animal is completely burned up. We discover in verse 19 that these burnt offerings have to be male animals. There are other animals that are specified as strictly female, and then there are some that they don't specify one or the other. So what we've got in the Bible, in the book of Leviticus, we have the burnt offerings, the Holocaust, and then we have the partial burnt offerings, which were called the food offerings. And then we have another type of offering that we haven't come to yet, but we will come to later today, that's called a votive offering. These three type of offerings were free will offerings. Actually, the peace offering was a free will offering of sorts as well. The votive offering conceivably would be subsumed under the peace offerings. Then after that, we had sin offerings. That was for inadvertent sins. And then after that, we had the trespass offerings, which we just mentioned moments ago. The trespass offerings were sacrifices that were meant to make amends for one's becoming ceremonially unclean. Verses 21 through 24. Now we have what I just mentioned before, peace offerings, and they are characterized as vows. Thus, the peace offerings came in two types. They came in thanksgiving offerings, and they came in also the form of a votive offering. Votive is related to the word vow. In other words, you make a vow to the Lord, and you make the sacrifice then, and then as a pledge that you will fulfill the vow, or you first fulfill the vow and then bring in the animal to fulfill the pledge. You could do it either way. So we learn something here too, making an interesting distinction between the sacrifices. Castrated animals are acceptable to offer as free will offerings, that is to say, burnt offerings. However, if you make a votive offering, you are not permitted to bring a castrated animal. It has to be an animal that's intact. If it's male, I'm assuming it's a very young specimen, because the older that these rams and bulls get, the more aggressive and dangerous they become. Going into verse 25, sacrifices. This is a verse that again refers to the sacrifices as the bread of God. This is, again, not to use a pun, this is feeding in to the idea that these people are feeding their God. They're offering up the bread of their God. They're offering sacrifices that are pleasing to the nose of God. These are anthropomorphisms. These are concessions to the pagan mindset of the Hebrews. Interestingly enough, no foreigners are allowed to offer these sacrifices. So no foreigner is allowed to become a sacrificing priest in Israel. This is a racially exclusive caste. It's the tribe of Levi, clan of Kohath, family of Aaron. Now, if somebody was from the tribe of Levi, he's from the same tribe as these priests, but he can't be a priest. If somebody is from the tribe of Levi, clan of Kohath, well, he's from the same family, just like Moses was, but he can't be a priest. One has to be a descendant of Aaron. It is an extremely exclusivistic caste. Chapter 22, verses 26 through 28. This is another section that I believe is misplaced because it's talking about burnt offerings again. And what it tells us in this passage is that calves, kids, and lambs may not be killed on the same day as their dams, D-A-M. That's the female who has given birth to the calf, the lamb, or the kid. Verses 29 through 30. This is something that's also misplaced. This is talking about peace offerings. This tells you about the disposal of the peace offering. Therefore, in my opinion, this should go in chapter 3 with the peace offerings. So what it tells us is, for a peace offering that's an offering of thanksgiving and not a votive offering, it has to be eaten on the same day that it's offered up. Chapter 22, verses 31 through 33, which concludes the chapter. This is just a concluding statement regarding the sacrifices. To review, there are certain items in this chapter that are out of place. They should go in the first 7 chapters, which deal with the sacrifices. The rest of it deals with priestly regulations. Conceivably, then, those priestly regulations, if we were reorganizing Leviticus, would go before chapter 8, which begins the opening week of the tabernacle's services. After all, one has to know what the regulations of the priests are before the priests end up going to work. Am I right?
Yep.
Yeah, I think so. We are now in chapter 23. Chapter 23 is a very popular chapter in Leviticus, if it's possible to link the word Leviticus with the word proper, because it's a much avoided book. But chapter 23 deals with the festivals. The festivals that are listed in here have generated a certain amount of controversy because people on all sides of Christianity, whether you're talking about Catholic, Protestant, or even Eastern Orthodox, want to tell you that everything in the Old Testament points toward Christ. Well, that's a nice thought, but it's rather hard to prove that, and you end up with some very thorny problems. In the first interview in this series, you and I talked about the 2 birds that are offered up in the sacrifice of a leper. If somebody reenacted this ceremony today, we would assume the person was a Satanist or a practitioner of voodoo. We would not assume that we're not going to assume that he's a Christian who's trying piously to reenact the laws of the Old Testament. We wouldn't make that assumption. It is ludicrous, in my opinion, to say that these sacrifices represent Christ. In chapter 23, we are dealing with feasts. And people, especially in the Hebrew roots movement, want to say that every one of these feasts is fulfilled in Christ. That's a controversy, because even people who are very adamantly on the side that Christ fulfills Leviticus sometimes tell you that Christ only fulfilled the spring sacrifices and actually did not fulfill the fall sacrifices, or maybe the fall sacrifices are yet to come and they're going to be fulfilled in the second coming.
Yeah.
Bottom line is, there's a lot of controversy associated with chapter 23 and these feasts. Let's get into it. Chapter 23, verses 1 through 2. We have an introduction to the feasts. And then in verse 3, we have another verse that's blatantly out of place. This is a verse about the 10 commandments, namely Sabbath keeping. Clearly, this belongs with all of the other iterations of the 10 commandments in Leviticus. It doesn't belong here. It's out of place. Verses 4 through 5. We come to the one feast here that's not controversial. This is the Feast of Passover. It directly tells us in 1 Corinthians 5:7 that Christ is the Passover. John the Baptist refers to Christ as the Lamb, and he's pointing back to the Passover. And what day is Christ killed on, according to the Gospel of John? Anyone?
Passover.
Exactly. Christ is killed on Passover. Obviously, this one is fulfilled by Christ. And I will point out that this is not being established in Leviticus 23, verse 4. This was established in Exodus chapter 12, long before this. This is a pre-golden calf sacrifice. If anyone has listened to my podcast series, which is available at paulvendredi.com, I go into this in quite a bit of detail. My thesis, at least one of my theses in that series, is that Christ fulfills the pre-golden calf sacrifices. He does not fulfill the sacrifices that come thereafter. The sacrifices that come after the golden calf are punitive and merely an accommodation to paganism. Chapter 23, verses 6 through 8. This is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It occurs a day after Passover and lasts for 7 days. On each day, a burnt offering is offered. This is slightly more controversial than Passover. Does Jesus fulfill this? Jesus was in the tomb as this is going on, so maybe he's fulfilling it during the harrowing of hell, but I think that's a little too controversial to make a statement about. If we're going to say, if you really want some argumentation on behalf of Christ fulfilling the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I'll point you to the works of certain groups like the Jews for Jesus or other Hebrew roots type of Christian groups. They are very adamant that Jesus fulfills all of these. Again, I would point you to their work because I'm not going to expend any effort trying to say that Christ fulfilled this one. Chapter 23, verses 9 through 14. This is the Feast of First Fruits. Again, we're dealing with a controversy about whether Jesus fulfills this. There are arguments pro and con. I'm not going to weigh in on it, at least not in today's show. I'll just describe what's going on here. Verse 10, the offerers have to bring a sheaf of their first fruits. Verse 12 tells us that they also have to bring an offering, a burnt offering of a yearling lamb. Thus, you take a lamb that's about a year old and you offer it up in accordance with the burnt offering rules in chapter 1. Verse 13, they also have to bring a grain offering, and this is the first mention of this in the book of Leviticus. They also bring a drink offering. This drink offering happens to be wine. Offerings of liquids are called in anthropology and history of religion libations. They don't use that term here. They just call it a drink offering. I like the term better because it's not as confusing. Libation is a fancy word. Drink offering is a straightforward phrase that makes a lot more sense. So this is the first time, and if memory serves, the drink offerings only come up one more time in Leviticus. So technically speaking, we have yet another type of sacrifice here. The sacrifice of libation, i.e. pouring out a drink offering to God. Moving on to verses 15 through 21. This is the Feast of Pentecost. It's pretty uncontroversial that this is fulfilled in the New Testament as well. In this case, it's fulfilled by the apostles in the book of Acts. So technically speaking, Christ doesn't fulfill it, but it is fulfilled by his apostles. By extension, then, you could say that Christ fulfills it. If we just want to be as general as possible, we can say that Pentecost is fulfilled in the New Testament. I'm going to give you a bit of description here. Chapter 17, the offerer has to bring 2 wave loaves. So when we say wave, it literally means wave, like this.
Yeah, they're waving the loaf in front of the Lord.
Exactly. And the idea there, again, is a concession to this anthropomorphic mindset that we have some big exalted man with body parts and passions like the Mormons do. And he's got a nose, so we're causing the aroma of this offering to waft up to his nostrils. Verse 18, the offering also includes a burnt offering. This one is pretty extensive. 7 yearling lambs, a bullock, 2 rams, and a drink offering. This is the second mention of drink offerings that I had alluded to. Okay, verse 19, they also have to offer a sin offering, and that's 1 kid. A kid, to remind the listeners, is a young goat. And they also have to offer a peace offering of 2 lambs. So you've got burnt offerings, sin offerings, and peace offerings. Thus, the burnt offering is voluntary, although it seems to be mandatory here, which is confusing. Then you have the sin offering. The sin offering is offered up for any kind of inadvertent sin you might have committed. And then the peace offering is another type of these Thanksgiving offerings. The Thanksgiving offerings were voluntary, just like the burnt offerings. Therefore, the wording of this whole passage, verses 15 through 21, is very confusing because it's mandating what has to be brought on Pentecost, but it's mandating 2 of the 3 things it mandates or two of the three animal offerings that it mandates are supposed to be voluntary. That's something controversial that'll have to be cleared up by more study. More on that anon. Verse 22 of chapter 23. We're in a type of passage here that I call a conquest of Canaan passage. There were quite a few of these in chapter 19, but you may recall that we sort of skipped over chapter 19 because we had spent so much time convulsed on the commandment about adultery. Well, chapters 18, 19, and 20 contained a lot more than references to adultery. They also contained a lot of these conquest of Canaan passages. These are passages about what the Israelites will do when they occupy the promised land. Thus, it's not clear whether those are to be one-time observances or whether they are always to be observed when the Israelites are in the promised land. We're looking at verse 22. This is a rule about not gleaning your vineyard. Presumably, this would apply for all time. By gleaning, we mean you go into your vineyard, you're taking the grapes off of the vines, but there are also grapes on the ground that have fallen off. If you pick all of those up, that's called gleaning. The Bible tells you not to glean your fields. What you do is you just harvest your field and you leave the gleaning on the ground where it's fallen. And then at night, the poor of the countryside can come in and pick up the gleanings and live off of that. In other words, this is a type of poor relief. By the way, if we're going to apply this to modern politics, this would tell us that poor relief is the responsibility of private charity and private individuals. It is not the duty of the government.
Yes.
When the government does poor relief, just like it does with anything else, it messes it up and turns it into a calamity. As we see with our modern welfare state, as we see with everything that was put in place by Lyndon Johnson and Franklin Roosevelt. Enough on that. This conquest of Canaan verse is out of place, I believe, because right after that, we go back into the feasts. In verses 23 through 25, we have something called the Feast of Trumpets. This one is very vaguely worded. All we know is that trumpets are blown on this particular feast. That's all we know about it. I had said in a previous interview that it's very difficult to reconstruct the liturgics of Leviticus. In this case, it's also difficult to reconstruct the festivities of Leviticus.
Do you think that with the Feast of Trumpets that God is looking forward to Jericho?
I have no opinion on that. The people who are keen on saying that Christ fulfills all of these say that this is fulfilled in the book of Revelation. There are several references to trumpets in the book of Revelation. As you may be aware, I'm wading into yet another controversy here, perhaps needlessly. I'm doing this advisedly. The Eastern Orthodox Church does not ever read the book of Revelation aloud in any of its liturgical services. The liturgical services have what are known as a lectionary. The lectionary tells the priest or the reader or whoever is conducting the service what passages from the Bible are to be read on that particular day. If one attends the Orthodox Church at every conceivable liturgical service throughout the year, one will hear the entire Bible, the entire New Testament read, except for the book of Revelation. A person will hear every verse of the New Testament, but not a single verse from the book of Revelation. The thinking on that is that the book of Revelation was so bizarrely written that it simply could not be understood without lots and lots of explanation. And most of the priests were not educated enough to give their flock an education on what Revelation actually meant. Consequently, the church just said, we're not reading this. And also consequently, Orthodox theology developed without any reference to the book of Revelation. If the book of Revelation ceased to exist, if every copy of it disappeared, Orthodoxy would not be affected, because the book of Revelation has no say in Orthodox theology, which is sort of curious because there are lots of liturgical scenes in the book of Revelation, lots of offering of incense, lots of intercessions of dead saints, lots of intercessions of angels. It's got a lot of stuff that would be useful to Eastern Orthodoxy apologetically, but it doesn't get used. And in fact, my favorite church father, Gregory of Nazianzus, when listing the books that belong in the New Testament, left it off. So in Gregory of Nazianzus' understanding, the book of Revelation was not a book of the New Testament. Enough on that controversy. I'm going to move on to chapter 23, verses 26 through 32. This is more information on the Day of Atonement. We covered the Day of Atonement in a previous interview. It's covered in chapter 16, but we get more information on it in these verses. So we get some additional information. Verse 27, there's a burnt offering that's offered. It doesn't specify what it is, but if we go back to chapter 16, it's probably referring to the ram. Verses 28 through 30. It tells you that the Day of Atonement is not to be a day of joy and festivities, to be a day of fasting, humiliation before the Lord, and repentance. And anyone failing to fast, according to verses 28 through 30, will be executed. Very draconian. All right, so let's think. We talked about chapter 16, the Day of Atonement, being better placed behind chapters 8, 9, and 10, which dealt with the opening week of the tabernacle, and then the death of Nadab and Abihu with their offering of strange fire. This tells us that the Day of Atonement is to be a day of penance. That fits in with my thesis that the Day of Atonement is reparation, if you will, for the transgression of Nadab and Abihu. So this is a type of penance that's imposed on the Israelites. The book of Leviticus is a punishment that's imposed on them, and the Day of Atonement is a punishment within a punishment. This fasting is alluded to in the book of Acts. The Apostle Paul is on one of his many voyages, and it says that he's fasting in accordance with the feast. Doesn't tell you what feast it is, but the scholars who look at it and examine the time frame of that story tell you this is referring to the Day of Atonement. Of course, that's a controversy too, because wait a minute, hasn't Christ already died and resurrected by the time Paul is doing that? And doesn't Jesus fulfill all of this?
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe the apostles hadn't quite figured out all of that stuff yet. That's something to keep in mind. And I'm directing this, no offense. A lot of Pentecostals like to say, this is the church of the book of Acts, brother. Well, you know, a lot of what happens in Acts is simply recording the follies of the apostles. The apostles didn't always know what they were doing. And in fact, a lot of what they did in the book of Acts had to be rectified in the later epistles, and also was rectified in the early days of the church. This is controversial too, so I'm going to drop it right there, and we're going to go back to the feasts. Looking at verses 33 through 36, the Feast of Tabernacles. This is also called the Feast of Booths. Indeed, the King James uses the word booth a little bit later in the description. Verse 36 tells us that this lasts for 8 days, and on each of those 8 days, the people have to bring a burnt offering. Again, this is like a mandatory, voluntary thing, if we can have such an oxymoron. Verses 37 through 38, we have a misplaced passage here too. This is the conclusion to the discussion on the feasts. But for some reason, it's put right into the middle of the description of the Feast of Tabernacles. I'm going to say it again. Whatever person or persons reassembled the book of Leviticus did their job completely incompetently. It is absolutely, whoever did this should be embarrassed. because this is supposed to go right before verse 44, which is the last verse of the book of this particular chapter. Okay, so tabernacles. Is this where we are? We're on the tabernacles, right? Okay, we're going back to the tabernacles. Now we're in verses 39 through 43. We had that very confusing interposition of the conclusion of the chapter. We get back to this, and it says that in addition to those sacrifices, the people basically have to camp out. They're not allowed to stay inside their houses. They have to build little booths, that is to say, little tabernacles, and dwell in those for 7 days. The kids probably had a lot of fun with this because it was like a big camp out, but it was probably a massive annoyance and inconvenience for everyone else. Verse 44, as I said moments ago, this is the conclusion. At least this is the last part of the conclusion. The other concluding part was verses 37 through 38. We're done with chapter 23, which concerned all the feasts. Chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Chapter 24, verses 1 through 4 is instructions about the menorah. The menorah is the candle that was inside the holy place. The candlestick holder, I should say. Everybody knows what that looks like. It's the candle that has the looping branches, and there's a candle in each of those branches. Verses 5 through 9 tell us about the showbread, which is also in the holy place. These verses, chapters 24, verses 1 through 9, seem to me to be out of place. This is talking about basically the contents of the holy place and seem more likely that they belong with Exodus, because the book of Exodus is what gives us the blueprint for the temple, or excuse me, for the tabernacle, and how the tabernacle is supposed to be laid out. These just appear out of nowhere. Now, if they do belong in the book of Leviticus, then they should probably go before chapter 8, which is the beginning of the services in the tabernacle. After all, we have to know what's in the tabernacle before we start serving therein. Chapter 24, verses 10 through 6. We're dealing here with another elaboration on the 10 Commandments. And this is an elaboration on the commandment about taking the name of the Lord in vain. At this point, it's embedded in a narrative. This is one of only 2 narratives in the book of Leviticus. The first narrative is the Nadab and Abihu event. And the second narrative is this one, where a half Egyptian, half Israelite man commits blasphemy and is executed for it. It's interesting that the passage begins by telling us that the bad guy is of mixed race. Remember what I was telling you about the messages that the Old Testament gives us about race mixing? This is one place where it seems to be indicating that is bad. It's saying, look, here's this mixed race guy and he did this bad thing. Maybe that's the case, maybe it's not. I'm trying to deal with the Bible honestly. I understand it is extremely unpopular to be against mixed race marriages, but I'm saying this appears to be what the Bible teaches. By the way, that was the view of almost every American Protestant until forced integration under President Eisenhower. If you look at the claims of the various Protestant denominations that they were making in the 40s and 50s, they were saying that the Bible teaches and enforces racial segregation. There are some people who look back on this and say they were right. Well, as soon as the government mandated racial integration, overnight it became politically impossible to say anything against integration or anything against mixed race marriages. In essence, Protestantism caved in to political correctness, because prior to this, every Protestant in the United States was saying, no, segregation is biblical. Mixed race marriage is unbiblical. And there are people who look back on that now with hindsight and say they were right. Well, what happened to their claims? They just buried them. It's the same thing back after the Civil War. I'm not going to take sides here, but the North and the South in that era were lands of very pious people. You would read newspaper articles back in the 19th century, and the newspaper articles would quote Bible passages as substantiation for whatever point the journalist was arguing. It was a very pious nation back then. And the South, because of certain circumstances, because it was raising cotton, was using slavery, was using slave labor for that. The North didn't raise cotton. It raised a crop that was much less labor intensive. Namely, it was raising wheat and barley. Consequently, by that fluke, by that circumstance, the North did not have slaves. So this began affecting the mindsets of North and South. The South, and remember, both North and South are arguing from the Bible, argued that slavery was mandated in the Bible. I know you said in an earlier show you don't believe that. The South said it was the case, and scholars who look back on this now said that the South had the better biblical arguments. So if we are arguing only from the Bible, we would have to say that the South was the justified cause in the Civil War and not the North. But what happened at the end of the Civil War? The South lost. They had to surrender. And about a week later, Abraham Lincoln, who was not popular at all, not even in the North, got assassinated. That assassination turned him into an instant saint. Consequently, any argumentation that the South had made in favor of slavery, they suddenly had to bury. If you look at the constitutions, if you look at the Constitution of the Confederacy, and if you look at the Constitution of the individual states in the Confederacy, all of them explicitly said that we enforce slavery. They buried that. They dropped that like a hot rock and buried it as soon as Lincoln was assassinated, because it was no longer politically viable to have that position. So what I'm saying here is American Protestants are animated less by the Bible than they are by political correctness. After the Civil War, massively and suddenly politically incorrect to say that slavery is biblical. After integration, under Eisenhower, overnight, not possible to say that you're in favor of segregating your church. Okay? I've gotten off onto a little bit of a tangent, so I'm going to move on.
I would just say that obviously these things are part of the Old Testament, and we're not under the Old Testament. We're not under the.
So can we commit adultery?
Well, no, but
that's Old Testament.
That's a universal moral principle, and it's included in the New Testament.
Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but slavery was also included in the New Testament. Servants, be subject to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the froward. That's from 1 Peter chapter 2. The word there that's translated as servant is doulos, which in Greek means slave. In fact, even John MacArthur says that that means slave. All right, we're about to butt heads on this, I can see. But we're on the same show, and we're supposed to be talking about Leviticus. Therefore, I'm going to drop what we've just been talking about, and I'm going to go on to verses 17 through 21. Actually, let me finish up with verses 10 through 16. So the mixed race person commits blasphemy. Then, interestingly, in verse 14, the congregation lay their hands on his head. We've been hearing about people laying their hands on animals all throughout Leviticus. Now they're laying their hands on the head of a criminal. Then it tells you in verse 16 that foreigners have to obey the same laws that Israelites obey. Okay, then we go on to verses 17 through 21. This appears to be out of place. It's breaking into this part on blasphemy, and now it's going over to the commandment of thou shalt not kill. We learn that thou shalt not kill broadly covers a number of things. It covers murder, grievous bodily harm, and it also refers to killing animals. If you kill an animal, you have to make restoration for it. If you commit grievous bodily harm on another person, you have to make restoration, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. And if you commit murder, then you yourself are killed. At this point, verses 22 through 23, it goes back to the narrative about the mixed race blasphemer. And it tells you in verse 22 that foreigners have to obey the law. And after it tells you that, they kill the blasphemer by stoning him. Now we're in chapter 25. Chapter 25, by and large, deals with the Jubilee. And there's a few elements in it that seem to be out of place as well. Let's begin. Verses 1 through 7. This talks about when the Hebrews are going to come into the promised land. So I'm calling this another conquest of Canaan passage. Not clear whether this is something that's to be observed every year or whether it's a one-time thing when they enter Canaan. But it tells you on the 7th year, we don't know if that's the 7th year of their coming into Canaan or if it means every 7 years after you come into Canaan. Whatever the case, the land has to lie fallow and the draft animals will do no work. All right, you're an old farmhand. Do you want to explain to the viewers what fallow means?
Fallow means that you don't even till the ground. You just leave it rest. Farmer might, back in the old days, he might leave, like we don't have this outside of the Old Testament. No Gentile ever performed the Jubilee like this, but a farmer might leave a certain field fallow because when the field is left fallow, it restores the soil. Anyways.
Yep, that's it. Verses 8 through 10. This is where we start discussing a festival that's known as a Jubilee. The Jubilee was already known to the Hebrews because they had spent 400 years in Egypt, and Egypt was a nation that observed a number of Jubilees. The most famous Jubilee that the Egyptians observed was called the Hebsed Festival. This is when the decrepit old Pharaoh appeared in public and ran a foot race against a couple of young bucks. And of course, the Pharaoh had to win. The young bucks had to pretend that they lost to the Pharaoh. What this was meant to do was symbolically rejuvenate, that is to say, make the Pharaoh young again. And by rejuvenating the Pharaoh, also thereby rejuvenate the land. So it was kind of a symbolic festival. God knows that the Hebrews have been exposed to this. They probably have a taste for Jubilee observances. So he allows them to have a Jubilee, but he invests it with ideas and concepts that are a little more godly. So we come to verses 8 through 10. Verse 8 tells us that these Jubilees are to take place every 49 years. They begin on the Day of Atonement with the blowing of a trumpet. That may have something to do with the Feast of Trumpets that we learned about earlier and couldn't really discern anything about. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Verse 10. Can you scroll down so we can see verse 10? There it is. It says, and proclaim liberty throughout all the land unto all the inhabitants thereof. That's the verse that's on the Liberty Bell, just as an interesting historical note. Verses 11 through 12, in all of these Jubilee years, the land has to lay fallow. Verses 13 through 17. The Jubilee year is also a year when a person returns to his ancestral property. So if a person has sold his property, he can go back and buy it back from whatever person he's bought it from. If he has the means to buy back his property, the person who has bought it from him has to sell it to him. This appears to be some kind of means of maintaining a family bequest, and perhaps it has to do with filiation. That is to say, we know whose son you are. So we know whose son you are, and we know what your property is. That may be the idea behind all of this. Verse 18, this is a conclusion about the Jubilee, calling it statutes and judgments. We had talked about the words statutes, judgments, ordinances, laws. This appears to be out of place. It looks to me like this passage actually belongs at the end of the Jubilee passage and not where it's currently placed. Verses 19 through 20. The Jubilee year, this is telling you again that the land has to lay fallow. It appears to me that these verses actually belong between verses 11 through 12, because that's where it was talking about the fallow land to begin with. Hey, Jubilee year, verses 23 through 29. If you have sold land and you cannot afford to buy it back, then in the Jubilee year, a kinsman of yours can buy back the land for you, and the person who bought it from you has to sell it. I think that Protestants refer to this as the kinsman redeemer idea. It sounds like a pretty good term for it. Verses 29 through 31. This deals with houses that have been sold. If you live in a walled city and you sell your house that's within that walled city, you can buy it back within a year of selling it if you get seller's remorse and the seller has to sell it back to you. If you don't get it back within a year, then you never can buy it back. It belongs perpetually to the person who bought it from you. Verse 31, if you sell a house that happens to be in an unwalled city, then the seller can buy it back at any time. It doesn't have to be on the Jubilee. These are rules that will take a little bit of looking at to understand, but there they are. Verses 32 through 34, we're dealing with houses again, but this time we're dealing with houses that belong to Levites. Let me pause for a minute. The book of Leviticus is named after the Levites. This is what it's called in the Septuagint. When they translated it from Hebrew into Greek, for whatever reason, they used a Greek term that referred to the Levitical caste. This is the only time in the book of Leviticus that the Levites are ever mentioned. The Levites are a suborder of the priesthood. They're also a tribe. They became a suborder of the priesthood in Exodus 32. Becoming a suborder of the priesthood was their reward for killing the idolaters who had browbeat Aaron into building the golden calf. If we're going to be totally accurate about the name of the book, Leviticus should be called Aaronicus, because this is all about the Aaronic order. It is not about the Levitical order. The Levitical order had different priestly duties than the Aaronic order. Those priestly duties are laid out in the other books of the Pentateuch, and they're also laid out in later books of the Old Testament. In fact, the distinction still existed in the New Testament period, because when we hear about the parable of the Good Samaritan, it says that first a Levite passes by him, and later on a priest passes by him. In other words, first came by a Levitical priest, then came by an Aaronic priest. Back to the verses 32 through 34.
Oh, okay. Keep going.
Right. So verses 32 through 33, if a Levite sells his house, he can buy it back at any time. Now, you recall from the earlier verse that that does not apply to a non-Levite. A non-Levite has to buy back his house within 1 year. As far as fields and actual land that belong to Levites, that can never be sold. The reason for that is because when they move into the promised land, we had Levitical cities. So there had to be farmlands that supported those Levitical cities. Therefore, these lands, they would not have been able to have that kind of system if the land had somewhere along the line become alienated from the Levites who originally owned it. That's the reasoning behind this particular rule. Verses 35 through 38, this is another conquest of Canaan rule. This does not apply just to the Jubilee year. This applies to when you are in the land, the promised land that you're going to. When an Israelite brother of yours falls on hard times, you are not allowed to charge him interest. The King James Bible uses the word usury. Usury refers to excessive interest. So maybe this means you can't charge a fellow Israelite excessive interest, but in all likelihood, it means you can't charge him interest at all. You either just have to give him money or you loan him money without interest, and then just the principal comes back, just the original comes back to you. Okay, it also says that if he's in need of food, don't sell him the food, just give it to him. In other words, this is a type of rule on neighborliness. So we could be talking about the commandments, the 10 commandments of not coveting your neighbor's property, not bearing false witness against your neighbor. Those 2 commandments perhaps could be expanded to incorporate all of these rules about neighborliness. Verses 39 through 43. In the Jubilee year, any Israelite who has sold himself to you, and we're assuming that you're an Israelite as well, has to be released. So here's the rule. Israelites in the land of Israel can serve as hirelings, but they cannot be slaves of other Israelites. They can be a hireling of an Israelite, but not the slave of that Israelite. And they have to be released from their indenture in the Jubilee. So this is an instance where we can say that these are indentured servants. The indentured servant has to go free in the Jubilee year. When you move on to verses 44 through 46, we're dealing with non-Israelites. In other words, these are people who are slaves. They are foreign-born slaves. These slaves are not to be released in the Jubilee years. They remain slaves forever and, in fact, are passed down as property to your kids in the inheritance. That's not going to sit well with the apologetics industrial complex because they assure us that the Bible is against slavery. They're going to have to explain Leviticus 25, verses 44 through 46. Continuing on the theme of slavery, we go to verses 47 through 55. Again, we're dealing with Israelites. We talked earlier about an Israelite becoming a hireling of another Israelite. In like manner, an Israelite can become a hireling of a foreigner who's living in Israel. However, the hireling can be bought back at any time by a kinsman. That's the kinsman redeemer thing again. The hireling and his family must be released from indenture in the Jubilee. In my opinion, this particular passage should go after verses 44 through 46. Excuse me, I think I meant to say 39 through 43. Let me correct that on my spreadsheet. Okay, so we're dealing with hirelings, indentured servants, and slaves. These people, the indentured servants and the hirelings are affected by the Jubilee, but slaves, and the slaves have to be foreigners, they can't be fellow Israelites, remain slaves perpetually, Jubilee notwithstanding. I don't know if the slaves were allowed to buy their way out of slavery like they were allowed to do in the American South, or if they were just doomed to be slaves forever. It's not clear from these passages. Chapter 26, verse 1. This is an elaboration on the 10 Commandments regarding idols. You're not to rear up idols in your homeland. So let me say, we just jumped from chapter 25 through 26. Chapters 18, 19, 20, 23, 24, and 26 all contain elaborations on the 10 Commandments. These are all obviously out of order. They're supposed to be reordered and in order to make sense. What happens here, and I'm basing this on my study of the book of Leviticus, is when we have a liturgical religion, there is a bad tendency to think that strict observance of the liturgics and strict observance of the sacrifices equals moral rectitude. That's a real danger in any kind of liturgical or ceremonial religion. What happens, in my opinion, is this narrative about the mixed race Israelite Egyptian who commits blasphemy is what kicks off all of this section on the Ten Commandments. So he is used as an exemplar of someone who thinks that his observance of the ceremonial religion has made him pure, but in fact he has not. It's the Ten Commandments that really prove moral rectitude. And so we have this long elaboration on the Ten Commandments. So I believe that we have two parts of Leviticus. You have the whole ceremonial part, which ends up in somewhat of a disaster at the Nadab and Abihu event. So we start off with a description of the sacrifices. Then the sacrifices are implemented in that. Then we have the Nadab and Abihu conflagration. And then I think we have the second part of Leviticus where we have the Ten Commandments restated, because it's necessary to emphasize to these children of Israel that the Ten Commandments are the moral guideposts, not the sacrifices. That also strengthens my thesis that the sacrifices are merely punishment for the golden calf incident. Let's continue with chapter 26. Chapter 26, verse 2. This is another reference to the Ten Commandments, this time to Sabbath keeping. The Sabbath keeping is linked with reverence for the tabernacle. Sabbath keeping and reverence for the tabernacle are two things that have to do with Hebrew racial identity. Anything that deals with Hebrew racial identity is done away with in the New Testament. Thus, if we want to talk about the Ten Commandments, we're only beholden to 9 of them because the Sabbath observance has gone away. That's proven by Jesus openly breaking the Sabbath numerous times in the New Testament. Okay, verses 3 through 5. When we look at chapter 26, beginning at verse 3, and going all the way through verse 39, we're dealing with warnings and promises that have to do with obedience and disobedience. So beginning in verses 3 through 5, if the children of Israel are obedient, their crops will prosper. Verse 6, if they're obedient, they will have peace in their land. Verses 7 through 8, if they're obedient, God will grant them victory in their military campaigns. Verse 9, if they're obedient, they will be fertile and have many children. Having lots of children was viewed as a blessing back then. Nowadays, it's viewed as a burden. Verse 10, if the children of Israel are obedient, they will have bountiful crops, restating what it said in verses 3 through 5. Verses 11 through 13, if they are obedient.
Give me a minute, Paul. I got to take her out. I'm back. Sorry about that. She was going to interrupt the stream if I didn't take her out.
Your dog is clearly from the devil. Remember the story of the Gadarene swine? Maybe somebody cast a demon into her. Moving on to more serious matters, verses 11 through 13. If the children of Israel are obedient, their tabernacle will not be rendered desolate. In other words, it will still have an Ark of the Covenant in it. And by the way, this is another concession to anthropomorphism. God will dwell with his people, quote unquote, if the tabernacle is not desolate. Verses 14 through 16, we get into warnings about disobedience. 14 through 16, if the children of Israel disobey, they will have bad health. Verse 17, if they disobey, they will experience military defeat in their campaigns. Verses 18 through 20, if they disobey, they will experience crop failure. Verses 21 through 22, wild animals will multiply throughout the land and kill them. Verses 23 through 25, if they disobey, they will have plagues and they will be turned into slaves. 26, if they disobey, they will experience starvation. Verse 27 through 29, if they disobey, the starvation will become so bad that they resort to cannibalism. 30 through 32, if they disobey, the tabernacle will indeed become desolate. Verses 33 through 35, if they disobey, they will be sent into exile. Verses 36 through 39, if they disobey, whoever survives all of these calamities will survive with a spirit of defeat. So they will be crushed in their spirits. Let's quickly run through a lot of these. The tabernacle becoming desolate. Well, both the Romans and the Babylonians did that. The Babylonians destroyed the first temple, which was based on the pattern of the tabernacle, and they took away or destroyed the Ark of the Covenant. More likely the latter. Very unlikely they took it away. They probably just destroyed it. All right, the military defeat. That happened to Israel over and over, particularly when the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. Plagues and slavery. That again happened when the Romans laid siege to Jerusalem. Starvation and cannibalism. You can read Josephus here. That happened in circa 70 AD when Jerusalem fell to the Romans. They found that the people had starved to death inside the city. But there is hope. Verses 40 through 45 tell us that if the children of Israel repent, then these things will not happen to them and God will reverse the damage done to them. Verse 46 is the conclusion of the chapter. Now we're finally in chapter 27, which is the final chapter in Leviticus. We're dealing now with votive offerings. I had talked about those earlier. I'm going to use the word affluent. I'm using the word affluent very loosely here. I'm simply using it to mean not impoverished. In other words, if you had to pay a fine, you could pay it. It might be painful, but you could come up with the money. I'm going to use poor to refer to somebody who could not, under any circumstances, come up with the money to pay a fine. Now let's go on to discussing these votive offerings, verses 1 through 4. You can promise a man or a woman as a votive offering. Now, if you're promising an animal, that means you would either sacrifice it or you would pay to the priests the value of the animal instead. Well, you can do that symbolically, apparently, with human beings as well. You can vow a man who's between the ages of 20 and 60, or a woman, and you can get, that will be the equivalent of 50 shekels for the man and 30 shekels for the woman. I don't want to send the feminists into a furor, so I'm not going to speculate on why men and women are valued differently. Probably it just has to do with military service. Going down to verse 5, an affluent person between the ages of 5 and an affluent person can vow a person who's between the ages of 5 and 20. In that case, the males are worth 20 shekels and the females worth 10. Boys and girls, since we're talking, 5 to 20. Verse 6, an affluent person, and by the way, when we're talking about you can vow a person, we're talking about vowing somebody other than oneself. In other words, an affluent person would be vowing somebody in his household, whether a slave or a hireling, or in the case of that moron Jephthah in the book of Judges, vowing his own daughter. So here we go with verse 6. If it's between the age of 1 month and 5 years old, the boys are worth 5 shekels and the girls are worth 3 shekels. Again, 1 month old is not vowing himself. Somebody else is vowing him as a pledge. to the priesthood. Okay, votive offerings in verse 7. This is for people who are 60 years old and up. So in that time period, they would have been completely decrepit and broken down. Men and women equally are only worth 10 shekels at that age. Now, if you are a poor person and you want to offer somebody in your household as a vow, it's hard to imagine a poor person having a hireling or a slave in his employ, but let's say he did. In that case, you simply bring the person who's vowed to the priest, and the priest estimates the value of the person and then ratchets it down to a price that the poor person can actually afford to pay. Verses 9 through 10, these are votive offerings of clean animals. And then in 11 through 13, you have votive offerings of unclean animals. That strikes us as bizarre, since the kosher rules said you're not even allowed to touch unclean animals. But apparently there were people living in the society, perhaps an untouchable type of caste, who were allowed to deal with these animals. We learn in I talked about the Gadarene swine. What were people in Gadara doing raising swine? Jews were not supposed to be raising those kind of animals. So apparently there were people raising unclean animals even as far back as Leviticus. In this case, if you pledge your unclean animal, then you have to pay the value of that animal plus 1/5, and then you can take the animal back home and continue using it on the farm or whatever you're doing. Verses 14 through 15. This is making a votive offering of a house. In verse 14, you can straight up just give the house, we're assuming, to the priesthood. Or in verse 15, if you wish to keep the house, then you vow the value of the house to the priesthood plus 1/5 on top of that. So you're paying 1 1/5. 16 through 24, we have votive offerings of land. This is a pretty long passage, and it's very convoluted because the value of the land that you're vowing will change depending on how close or how far away you are from the Jubilee. Pardon me for a moment. Verse 25. We're still in votive offerings, and it's telling you how to value it. It has to be vowed according to the weight of the shekel of the sanctuary. In other words, it has to be based on just weights and measures. If we want to extrapolate this into the modern economy, we could say that your monetary system has to be based on some kind of objective standard. We used to have that with the gold standard. Unhappily, liberal Republicans like Richard Nixon, and do I need to say anything about the Democrats, helped to destroy the gold standard in this country. We no longer have a gold standard. That means the paper money in our pocket is basically the same value as monopoly money. I believe that this is saying that a nation should base its currency on some kind of objective standard, some kind of precious metal. For centuries, nations have made that metal gold. I suggest we go back to that. Verses 26 through 27. Clean and unclean animals. It's giving us some specifics on those clean and unclean votive offerings. If you're offering an unclean animal, it has to be the firstling. In other words, that has to be the first animal that's born of the dam, and the animal has to be sacrificed. It cannot just be vowed. In other words, you can vow an animal. The priest tells you how much the animal is worth, and then you pay the priest that money and then take your animal back. So if it's an animal that's doing work on the farm, obviously you want to keep that animal because it's very valuable to you. But the unclean animal, this is what you do. You bring it, you give him the price of the animal plus 1/5 on top of that. Again, it's hard to understand how this would operate with unclean animals since the priest is not supposed to touch these things. Verses 28 through 29. This is the most bizarre passage in all of Leviticus. We've been talking about votive offerings being a pledge of an animal that you own or of a person in your employ or family. For the persons, we were saying that you give the money and then, of course, take the person back. The person is valued according to his age and to his or her sex. The animal, you could do either one. You could either offer it to the temple to be to the priesthood to be sacrificed, or you could just vow it, i.e., you pay them the value of the animal and then take the animal back and continue using it on the farm. This verse is completely bizarre because look, maybe you want to read that. It's verses 28 through 29.
Notwithstanding no devoted thing that a man shall devote unto the Lord of all that he hath, both of man and beast, and of the field of his possession, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy unto the Lord. None devoted which shall be devoted of men shall be redeemed, but shall surely be put to death.
There it is. If we read this in the most straightforward reading that we can, this means that you can vow someone to the temple and you can either pay the value of that person or you can sacrifice the human being. I looked this up on Sermon Audio. I don't know if you've ever gone to that website called sermonaudio.com. It's a highly Calvinistic site. It has audio recordings of approved Calvinist preachers. One of the interesting features on this website is you can look up a verse and it will give you all of the links to these sermons on that particular verse. So you can look, if you want to look up Hebrews 9:27 or John 3:16, it'll give you all of the sermons where a person has preached based on that topic. I looked up Leviticus 28 through 29 using that feature, and it only came up with one sermon. I listened to the sermon, and the sermon said nothing about this verse. It had been mislabeled. In other words, there is not a single word on Sermon Audio about this passage. Everybody is dropping this passage like the Black Death. I did find some writings about this in apologetics works, and basically what they try to say is this is referring to the ban. In other words, when they went into the promised land, they had to kill all the men, women, children, and animals that they encountered. They basically had to be like a neutron bomb and get rid of all the life forms in the land and start anew. I don't think that works because this is talking about votive offerings. It's talking about things that you have devoted to the Lord. It's not talking about the ban. I have a lot more studying to do on Leviticus. I hope to come to some kind of resolution about this, but I am going to deal with this honestly, in the same honest way I deal with racial segregation and with mixed race marriages. I'm going to be honest about it when I do my study on the topic. For now, it looks to me like this is approving human sacrifice. And indeed, if we go to the book of Judges, Jephthah vowed that he would offer up to the Lord the first person who came out of his household to greet him, and it turned out to be his daughter. So the book gives you, the book of Judges gives you a very ambiguous denouement to the subject, to the story. But if you read that in the most straightforward way possible too, it means that Jephthah eventually killed his daughter in fulfillment of his vow. If you read Gleason Archer, who wrote the book Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties, or if you listen to the Protestant radio show host Steve Gregg, they twist themselves into a pretzel to say that Jephthah did not kill his daughter, that instead she was simply devoted to the temple, to the tabernacle as some kind of oblate. I don't think that holds any water either, because only men of the Aaronic order were allowed inside of the tabernacle.
Yeah.
And if they needed things done outside of the tabernacle, they have other Aaronic priests. And in fact, they have the entire tribe of Levi, the Levitical priesthood. This is why I said that I swore off apologetics many years ago, because in order to fit our preconceived notions into the Bible, we have to twist ourselves into a pretzel. I am provisionally saying here that in certain circumstances in the Old Testament, God allowed human sacrifice. That's a tough one for me to say because I am militantly against that. And I am militantly against that, especially from the standpoint of opposing penal substitutionary atonement. But we have this bizarre passage here that nobody wants to deal with. And in fact, I'm done dealing with it now too, because I've already got myself in deep yogurt. Let's move on to verses 30 through 31. This refers to tithing. You have to give 1/10 of your crop over to the priesthood. If you don't, if you want to keep that crop for yourself, then you have to pay them the value of the crop plus 1/5. Then we go to a rule on tithing animals. This is verses 32 through 33. This is an incredibly confusing rule. I'm not going to try to untangle it. And then finally, verse 34 concludes the book of Leviticus. I want to say one last thing about chapter 27. This chapter 27 clearly belongs with the peace offerings of chapter 3. Yet it's been placed at the end of the book of Leviticus. I believe that the persons who reconstructed Leviticus put it at the end because they were embarrassed by it. After all, it has that horrendous passage that appears to support human sacrifice. So we have the book of Leviticus. We've spent a number of hours going through this book from chapter 1 through chapter 27. We've probably alienated and angered a lot of people along the way. I regret that, but we have to deal with texts honestly.
Well, I'm going to say a piece at the end, not to discount your work, not to put words in your mouth, but I want to remind people, so this came up about the time you were talking about slavery. Hi, Jordan, if you're still listening. I want to point out a couple things. Number one, at the bottom of all my videos, it says that the views of the guests don't necessarily reflect the views of the host and vice versa. We're free to agree to disagree on issues. This would be an issue where I disagree with Paul. But number two, Paul didn't say that he's A-okay with slavery, racial segregation, and all that stuff. He said the Bible has difficult passages on the subject, right? And so that doesn't mean that we're wrong about those issues. That means the Bible has difficult passages. We have to deal with those passages as they are. We can't just run from them or try to rework them. And so, none of us here are advocating for a return to slavery and segregation. I just want to say that for the record. None of us here are advocating for that. I don't even think Paul is advocating for that. Anyways, I just want to say that because the room got tense when you said that. And I don't want to go into a debate over the topic with you. I commend you for your work, your years of expertise and service to the word, especially on the issues of atonement and all that. Any final thoughts?
That sounds like a fair statement. I think we can close it out right there.
Okay. Well, like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow Paul Vendredi, because even if you disagreed with him on that, he's a great individual of the Lord. He's years of service, and he does great work on atonement. So anyways, without further ado, I'm going to close out in prayer. Dear Lord Jesus, please let this message be touching to someone. Let it cut through a bunch of the crap that you get from the industrial complex, or the apologetics industrial complex, as Paul likes to call it. Thank you for the fellowship we've had. Thank you for the ability to do these streams. In Jesus' name, amen. Until next time, peace.
We believe in one God, as revealed by Scripture in the person of Jesus Christ. Study to show yourselves approved.